General, representative body of the genuine and dedicated students of a discipline, much debunked and more often abused, but nevertheless basic to any kind of pedagogic engagement, I feel too humble to articulate in proper terms my gratitude and at the same time my utter surprise at being nominated to preside over the proceedings of this Platinum Jubilee session of the Indian History Congress. To one who somewhat reluctantly strayed into the profession of teaching history, the honor is as great as it is unexpected, and in return, I can only extend my gratitude to all historians, present or absent, who together constitute the Congress year after year and who, I am confident, will unitedly lead the Congress on to its centenary celebrations only a quarter of a century from now. While it's a great privilege to have been given the honor of presenting the first address as one among others who too will be delivering their addresses, it's by no means an easy task to choose the theme of the address. Meanwhile, let me say that the copies of the address are going to be distributed very soon, and you will see that the title of the address is Interrogating Unity in Diversity, Voices from India's Ancient Texts. The options which were open to me and the options which have been practiced so far seem to me to be somewhat limit the channels of easy communication. Both the past and current practices seem to present, at least to me, a dilemma of choice on an occasion which is for sharing and exchanging ideas, an occasion for reciprocal and not one-way communication. The dilemma may perhaps be overcome, I have felt, by posing a problem which is of common interest. The problem may not be of a purely historical nature, but which nevertheless requires to be viewed from a historical perspective. I am sure there are many issues of common interest in which historians, as also others, need to participate and receive fruitful feedbacks. Historians' habitual confidence of finding a final answer to any problem may be expected to experience severe drubbing when it's thrown into an open ring, but even so, in a space inviting open participation, no historian can afford not to offer his or her special input, without which one can confidently assert that no problem can be adequately explored. The problem which, if I am allowed to call it a historian's puzzle, as it appears as a contradiction in terms, has come to me in the form of the expression unity in diversity. It's an expression with which we all are familiar and which for long has been taken to be the apt characterization of what India represents. This is an expression with which our introduction to our own country begins at an early age, and this is an image of the country that we carry with us throughout our lives. If I have chosen to revisit this phrase on this August occasion, it does not necessarily mean that it would be to question the validity of what is nuanced in this phrase. It seems nevertheless necessary to ask afresh, since even recent commentaries on such issues fail to do so. One, what is the meaning of unity in the expression is, or what its limits are implied by its juxtaposition with diversity? In other words, if diversities are taken to constitute unity, at what state do diversities remain when the reference is to unity? Two, A more contingent historical question relates to the context in which the idea of unity emerged and continues to get embellished for whatever purpose. Since it's often found that the country's ancient civilization, or at least at most the pre-colonial Indian civilization, is invoked to buttress the idea of unity, it becomes necessary to examine the kind of empirical material from the past the spokespersons of the idea of unity were drawing upon. 3. If diversities of a country, in whatever sense the term diversity is used, are seen to have coalesced into a structure of unity, how do networks of diversities function within what is perceived as unity, and how indeed did they function in the past? Many more questions may be raised, but the sense of the apprehension that I am trying to articulate should be immediately understandable from what I have raised. If India does indeed represent the historical functioning of unity in diversity, then it's time that we revisit the history of its hold on our imagination to the extent that the current slogan of One India, without the essential caveat of its diversities, sounds almost like a threat. The idea that India is one territorial cartographical unit in the sense of an administratively governable country is colonial. I am prepared to make minor qualifications to the statement, but would still retain it in essence. The idea of the unity of the country is of course attractive and could be appealing to a newly emerging indigenous nationalist intelligentsia of the 19th, early 20th century as another invention of the period, the ethno-civilization category of the Aryans, an invention which was lapped up and continues to be lapped up by many Indian citizens, most of whom may live far beyond Aryabhata as it was delimited by Manu and others. It is understandable why in the early and more mature phases of the crystallization of our national consciousness, the idea of unity was unfailingly attractive not only to political thinkers and activists, but to creative writers and artists as well. The united opposition to the foreigner as the political master required a spontaneous opposition to the required a spontaneous amnesia of differences, at least partly, in the vindication of the imaging of a country and its peoples. The country could be conceived and represented as a motherland or as a goddess acquiring an iconography. Its inhabitants too could be conceived as a unity, as inhabitants of that country, Bharatvarshi. One among the early historical statements of the idea of unity was R.K. Mukherjee's The Fundamental Unity of India, which assembled mainly early and not so early textual evidence to suggest the presence of the consciousness of unity as a fundamental essence of Indian civilization. The idea of unity rather than diversity is projected as a normal Indian condition unless deviation from it has taken place in some periods of its past. In hundreds of our school textbooks written in the past and being written now, unity rather than diversity is thus assumed to be Indians' self-born quality, defying and dispelling the need for any inquiry about the past of the achievement of that unity. Historiographically, it seems curious that even recent attempts to deal with a concept such as cultural unity of India end up not by subjecting the concept itself to any critical query, but trying to find ways of rationalizing it in terms of the process of interaction between what is considered a great tradition and different little tradition or traditions, or by invoking the old notion of a perpetual oscillation between the trend towards centripetalism and centrifugalism. Only the terms have been thought to be indigenized, centripetalism having been Sanskritized into Kendravimukhi and centrifugalism into Prantavimukhi. It seems as though there was some kind of central agency in the past consciously ordering things about and deciding upon the elements of diversity to be subverted and the measure of unification or centralism to be achieved. What is indeed curious is that in perpetuating the use of such terms as centripetal and centrifugal, or of great tradition and little tradition, we perpetuate a notion which is not only value-loaded but also unhistorical. Despite the casually interjected caveat that it's useful to think of the cultural unity of India not as a thing out there somewhere, but as a process. What is conceived as great must have had a history of becoming so, as greatness, like littleness, is not self-born. As for considering centripetal as the desired goal and centrifugal as its undesirable aberration, the a priori assumption of its linkage with the idea of a unified country perceived by its inhabitants as their country is too obvious to be elaborated. The necessity of underlining the idea of unity, despite the cognitive compulsion behind admitting the differences, were many. In a particular historical context, it may be understood in terms of an emergent nationalist inspiration, but what appears indeed curious is the continuing reluctance to examine how Indians of the past, or at least some of them, looked at themselves and articulated their voices about those who they considered to be others. The nature of the perception of diversities and of differences in a society is an indicator of how its various constituent elements would interact with one another. If such diversities and reciprocal perceptions and interactions are found to constitute a design for unity for the complex reality of Indian society, even in the past, then too it would perhaps necessitate a fresh thinking regarding the sense in which the idea of Indian unity can be sustained. Further, even if we proceed with the idea of a pervasive culture spread something like a veil over the disparateness of diversities, the processes through which such a veil came to be woven requires, if not empirical validation, at the least some form of reasonable speculation. It's a requirement of history as a discipline, and to this requirement I may turn now with a great deal of diffidence. At this juncture I pause for a moment, and let me confess that since it will not be possible for me to read out the entire text of my address, I will make a selection of some of the empirical material that I will present, skipping the others, but the text of the address would be available to you, and I invite you to go through that assembled empirical material and form your opinion on the meaning of this material. In fact, my argument rests largely on the use of this empirical material, and I invite you to have a look at the same material and see if you agree or disagree with me. So I start with perceptions of diversity and difference. Even at the risk of appearing to draw a hasty, unwarranted design, what seems to characterize the thinking of early text writers is that the social situation was perceived as consisting either of binary opposites or as a combination of multiples. The relationship between binary opposites could be simply stated in clear terms of irreconcilable opposition, whereas among multiples the relation could be expressed in various ways as of differences which were a part of the social reality as a whole. If binary opposition was expressed in such terms as Arya and Dashu, as in the Rig Veda, The opposition was stated not simply in terms of the simultaneous existence of two groups, but also of the need of the Aryas to annihilate the Dashus because of the vastness of cultural difference between them. The difference between the Aryas and the Mlecchas, a kind of generic term which could include diverse ethnic groups, may have originated in linguistic difference, but the theoretical impracticability of the two categories merging into one remained firm throughout. The text writer's preference for whatever was associated with Arya made the Arya's image as nobler in relation to others, leading to differentiation and hierarchization between cultures on a significant scale. This could be extended to creating other cultural categories which could be taken to represent other types of binary oppositions: urban, rural, Janapada, Aranya or forest, Margi, Deshi, and so on. The notion of value assigned to binary opposites was very much present in the context in which geographical space inhabited by groups of peoples was conceived. Whether it was the five-fold division, seven-fold division, or nine-fold division of Jambudvipa or Bharatavarsha, both terms taken to correspond to India, space consisting of a number of separately specified inhabited spaces carried with it clearly the sense of difference between Madhyadesha or Aryavarta and the other quarters or Desh. Madhyadesha or Aryavarta was a land of purity with an ideal social order. Other quarters were qualitatively impure and inferior. The perceived boundaries of the sacred land may have differed from one period to the other, but the distinction in terms of purity remained. Manu, around the beginning of the Common Era, defined the country between the two rivers, the Saraswati and the Drishadvati, as the land of Veda, and the conduct of the four classes or varnas in that country, the country of good people. Similarly, the middle country and Aryavarta were both sacred in the sense that they were fit for sacrifices. In fact, Manu's land fit for sacrifices was sharply distinguished from the land of the barbarians, impure in the absence of Aryas. If the early city writers considered space in terms of sacredness and profanity around the beginning of the Common Era, we find Rajasekhara, the author of Kavyamimamsa, continuing with the same notion in the 10th century of that era. To him too, in his Kavyamimamsa, Madhyadesha was the source of good behavior, and the mode of the poets was derived from that region. The origin of the idea of difference between what was perceived as sacred or pure, in contrast to what was profane or impure, in the same way as Marga defied divine, and Desi, worldly or futile, may have derived from purely Brahmanical order of thinking, but any social reality had to be perceived in terms of the empiricality of it as variable, inconsistent, and prone to conflict, change, and individual agency. With regard to space, the binary division between sacred and not so sacred spaces could further be stretched to appreciating the empirical reality of the existence of numerous Janapada units, which were the basic habitat units of a community or a combination of communities. It was Janapadas or the Nadus of South India, or whatever else the expression was, which defined the spatial identity of those who resided in them. If one is permitted to take Tamilaham or the Tamil country as a space of the magnitude of a macro Nadu, comparable to a macro Janapada, it was the poet's perception of differences which represented its landscape. The differences did not relate to topography alone. The poems bring out the different landscapes of moods and responses corresponding to the physical landscapes, the hills and forests, the coastline, the riverine plains, the pastoral land, and the dreaded arid wasteland. It is, however, not mentioned in the majority of texts, including the Puranas, how the Janapadas mentioned in them differed from one another except in their locations in their respective quarters, whether it was east, west, and so on. The Janapadas or Nadus were many. With the passage of time, several Janapadas could emerge to become a Mahajanapada, a Rashtra, or a Desha. Only a comprehensive attempt at preparing a chronologically designed historical geography of India could reveal the changing number and distribution pattern of Janapadas, Nadus, Mahajanapadas, Rashtras, and other habitat of the political units across the space which was conceived as Bharatvarsha in our early texts. The reason for making reference to the Janapadas and Nadus and to the possibility of Supra-Janapada spatial political formations is that they were recognized, each consisting of its forest, village, and urban landscapes as spaces where human communities lived, by which they identified themselves and were identified by others. If the Janapadas were many, so were the ruling powers. Although the possibility of the emergence of a sovereign, a Chakravarti, whose chariot wheels moved on unhindered, was theoretically recognized and was in fact expected, the sovereign ruler did not rule over the country or over what was conceived as the Chakravarti's Kshetra. Sovereignty lay in the recognition of sovereignty by multiple rulers in their active acts of submission to the world conqueror. It's not that actual conquests and territorial annexations did not take place, or that historical empires did not adopt several severe measures to bring out some measure of administrative homogeneity in their territories. Even so, when historical rulers, in their lengthy processes written for them by their panegyrists, claimed victories over an impressive list of their contemporary rulers and kingdoms, the conquests boasted of were mostly cases of required rhetoric. Their claims to sovereignty and to performance of all major sacrificial rituals, sometimes thousands in number, were in conformity with the requirements of a Chakravarti king, linked in a close relationship with a multiplicity of subdued and submissive rulers. The relationship was ever oscillating because of the presence of the enemy in the scheme of polity. Envisioned by political thinkers, and any analysis of the concept of the circle of kings, mandala, has to be premised on the presence of a host of kings, hostile or friendly, positioned as if in a circle around a king intent on acquiring a sovereign status through conquests, that is, Vijigishu. The imagery of the wheel with a center notwithstanding, Kautilya or any other Arthashastra thinker certainly didn't think of one center or in terms of political centripetality and centrifugality. The conqueror's status was an open one, as is evident in Kautilya's assurance, and I quote Kautilya here, one, that is king, possessed of personal qualities, the ruling over a small territory, being united with the excellences of the constituent elements, that is, the elements of a state, Prakriti, and conversant with the science of politics, does conquer the entire art, never loses. I now proceed to a consideration of other types of differences, dharma, riti, pravritti, and other differences. Janapadas, it was argued, were many, and they denoted spaces an individual or a community belonged to, whatever its size and shape of the Janapadas. Early texts remained largely silent on what distinguished one Janapada for the other, Magadha from Anga, for example, apart from their approximate and somewhat incorrect geographical location. There is a suggestion of a measure of difference in reference to the existence of multiplicity of dharmas, not necessarily varying from Janapada to Janapada, but nevertheless suggestive of the currency of different policies, practices and customs. However, the impression that dharma in one sense related to communities and localities is suggested by a saying found in 16th century text, Yogini Tantra, which says dharma in Yogini Pitha, that is Assam, is of Kirata origin. Kirata being more or less a generic term for people of the northern mountains. Dharma in the end being incomprehensible, it was the practices followed by the wise in different localities which could be taken to represent dharma. When a king is forced to fight and conquer other countries, this is one of the policies that Manu advocates, probably because of the enduring strength of local practices. Manu is indeed not alone in suggesting the continuity of multiple dharmas. Other dharmasastras too, such as Yajnavalkya Smriti, go on to the extent of suggesting, and I quote from Yajnavalkya Smriti, whatever dharma is of the king in ruling his own country, Rashtra, the same dharma goes to the king in protecting the other countries brought under submission. Whatever the achara, vyavahara, kulastiti of the country brought under submission are to be retained as they are. The recommendation is further clarified by reference to Veda or distinct character and vritti, mode of living, which needed to be preserved. If the normative texts such as Manusmriti, Yajnavalkya Smriti and Narada Smriti were talking in terms of disparate dharmas in political spaces which were obviously separate and distinct, then texts which can be considered apolitical, such as Natyashastra and Kavyamimamsa, also underlined by drawing up schemas the differences in the nuances of lifestyles and in the ways men and women conducted and expressed themselves. In these schemas, how one Janapada or a locality or a region related to the other has to be seen as relationships of difference. There are very obvious difficulties in handling textual schemas, statements one comes across in the text are not necessarily factual but are indicative of perceptions and attitudes embedded in them. If one text makes derogatory comments on a particular cultural feature of a Janapada or a community, another may say exactly the opposite. In handling texts of this kind, and in fact texts in general, what one needs therefore is to try and trace regular attributes and elements of culture figuring in them which are put forward to mark out the difference between one Janapada and the other. That is to say that the texts do not make a statement of cultural relationship but rather of relationship of difference. Language and the ways in which it was articulated in both speech and writing were reference points for demonstrating difference, but there were other sites where differences were located and pointed out. Differences articulated in the form of divergent modes of cultural expressions can be traced to the text of Natyashastra Bharata, whatever be the date assigned to him by scholars. Bharata, writing on the origin of Natya or drama, deals in the beginning with the problem of applications, that is prayoga, and lists Bharati, Swatvati, Aravati and Kaushiki Vrittis, and it has been suggested that differences between them derived from different genres or communities in which the practices originated. Speaking of varieties of dramatic language, apart from reference to intonations of Sanskrit and Prakrit in the form of Ati Bhasha, Arya Bhasha, Jati Bhasha, Jatyantari Bhasha, the regional dialects listed by Bharata are 7: Magadhi, Avanti, Prachya, Saurasini, and so on. A recognition of the existence of other languages too does exist in Bharata. For example, for persons of Varvara, Kirata, Dravida and Andhra tribes, instead of their own language, dialects of Shurasena may be used. Bharata goes on to specify the exact dialects to be used for different roles, and in that context hints at the existence of additional language communities. The recognition and accommodation of differences in production of plays by Bharata was intended not simply to list them. They also implied hierarchy and status. Thus, of the 4 kinds of language to be used, Ati Bhasha was intended for use only by those enacting divine characters, and Arya Bhasha by kings. Jati Bhasha was of various kinds, mixed with foreign words common in Bharatavarsha. It was for rustics, foresters and animals, birds, etc., which were characters in a drama. Elaborating on Bharata's concept of vritti and pravitti, Rajasekhara of the 10th century too talked of pravitti, defined by him as Vesha Vinyasa Krama, that is sartorial styles, vritti defined as Nritya, Gita, Kalavilasha Paddhati, and Riti as Vachana Vinyasa Paddhati. In talking of difference, it is these features which appeared relevant to both Bharata and Rajasekhara. However, viewed even from these specific features, the diversities appeared so enormous that Rajasekhara posed the inevitable question and answered it. If the countries are so innumerable, how could they all be accommodated only within 4 categories? To this, Rajasekhara's answer, similar to that of Bharata, was even if the countries are countless in relation to Chakravarti Kshetra, they are imagined as 4-fold. Thereby it becomes irrelevant to think of endless number of countries. This attempt on the part of both Bharata and Rajasekhara to resolve the immensity of varieties available goes on only to highlight their anxiety over the necessity of bringing some order into a situation of chaotic disparateness. Let me turn to another kind of text, the Shastra of Kama. Although by now it should be clear that texts have a tendency to readily construct schema on the basis of assumed character traits and attributed attitudes. Nevertheless, even such unsubstantiated assumption of attributes would be based on experience of the existence of difference. In the area of karma, desire as well as physical love, one of the essential pursuits of human life, according to the Purushartha scheme, theoreticians such as Vatsyayana, the author of Kama Sutra, also define differences in attitudes and modes of social behavior under category of customs of different regions. Vatsyayana says, a man should treat a woman according to the nature of the region she comes from. The text characterizes Madhyadesha women, for example, along with women of Valika and Avantika, as opposed to kissing, scratching and biting, although they are fond of unusual sex acts. Well, there are other examples cited by in Kama Sutra, and in fact, a contrary view also incorporated in the text may assert that the nature of the individual is more important than the region, that local customs are not relevant to the matter, and that in course of time practices, styles of clothing and games move from one region to another. Even so, recognition of differences, which of course could be overcome, was an embedded perception which needed to be invoked whenever any classificatory schema came to be constructed. It is also necessary to stress the enumeration and classification of region in the text, even if they were not wholly or empirically verifiable schemas, were neither value neutral nor even intended to be objective. In almost all cases, characterizing differences also implied hierarchization and making value judgments in terms of perceived quality. Since such generalizations covered a really wide range and included character traits of Varnas, of regions, ethnic groups, sexual proclivities, it would be almost impossible to attempt a mapping of the possible patterns of interaction in society in this maze of differences and differentiated qualities. Perhaps the best available early examples of perception of difference, either in linguistic or in ethnic terms, are to be found in genres of texts that may be considered as non-sectarian, even irreverent in character. The monologue plays or Vanas, generally dated to the middle of the first millennium of the Common Era, are examples of this genre. Set in one major city or the other, such as Ujjaini, Pataliputra and so on, the play would be in the form of observations and observances on the peculiarities of human characters of diverse origin, made by the sole observer, narrator of the play. The Vana Padatarikata, which literally means kicked by the foot, for example, refers to representatives of different communities and localities such as Shaka, Yavana, Tushara, Parashika, Kirata, Kalinga and so on. The list is inexhaustible. The observer narrator of the play, the beater, who is an expert on erotic matters, harps on the theme of customs of localities, and in that context makes fun of how different communities behave. Referring to the Dindikas of latter, he remarks, and I quote here, they are not much different from the Pisachas, for all of them bathe naked, always wash their clothes themselves, even amidst drought, keep hairs disabled, go to bed without washing feet, eats this or that thing while walking, wears tattered clothes, even after striking one when one is in difficulty, they always boast of their bravery. Referring to the Daserakas in the same city, the reaction of the beater finds expression in the following terms. Here is a man, and I quote from the same Vana, here is a man with the face of a he-goat, whose loins are covered with a piece of cloth, and whose shoulders are full of thick hairs. He comes biting a radish. If he is not a Dasheraka, then he must be a devil. Where shall I wash clean my eyes polluted by seeing this Dasheraka? It goes on further, a Yavana courtesan in the same city, a female monkey, a man from Malava, and one addicted to amorous passion, a donkey and a singer, are all considered to have a common nature. Brahma, the text explains, is always apt to bring similar things together. Clarifying further, the beater goes on to add, who will listen to the Javana courtesans words which are like the chattering of monkey, full of shrill sounds and of indistinguishable consonants, and which are interspersed with the occasional display of forefingers. The same text, as can be expected, puts a character from Gandhara in the category of Hastimurkha, an elephantine fool, in the same manner in which a character from Dakshinarada, southwest Bengal, was branded as an incarnation of conceit in an allegorical play of the 11th century Prabodha Chandrodaya. As can be expected, he too, in his turn, had branded the entire world as full of idiots. If all that has been cited so far points in the direction not of a consciousness of unity, but of mutually distrustful diversities, then the extension of this perspective of mutual perceptions to the field of doctrinal and sectarian differences would reveal the same pattern, despite the stereotype of tolerance that marks Indian religious historiography. The tradition of contestation between different vadas or doctrines is fairly old. One can of course point to the fact that although differences did exist, it was the recognition of differences and respect for them as it advocated by Emperor Asoka in the 3rd century BCE that ensured the coexistence of pluralities in society. Asoka's message for mutual understanding and toleration of differences was, however, unique. Looking at it from an opposite perspective, it was also a recognition of the absence of tolerance necessitating imperial intervention. The entire history of Indian philosophy starts by making an initial distinction, vadas or doctrines, which were believed to be based on conformity to the authority of the Vedas. This, of course, should not be taken to mean that all doctrines seeking valorization with reference to the Vedas constituted an undifferentiated category. The others of the Vedic, which were non-Vedic or rather unvedic, were represented not only by the Nastikas or the Charvakins, the Saugatas of the Buddhists and the Nigantras of the Shapanakas or the Jains. They each split up in the course of history into many fragments, and there was still enough space left for new doctrines and new sects to emerge. The ground reality of the sectarian scenario in early India, or for that matter in other periods of Indian history as well, was that in the absence of a hegemonic faith or doctrine, which too could split up into irreconcilable segments, the difference could be variously articulated in terms of opposition, antagonism, ridicule, physical violence, and also in terms of amicable dialogues. There can be no simple formula for making intelligible the patterns of interrelationship between different faiths, religious practices and institutions and groups of practitioners in a situation of incomparably complex juxtaposition, characterizing it simply as an expression of religious tolerance or as synthesis and syncretism among different faiths would be negated by historical examples of acrimony, persecution and violence. Evidence of expressions of ideological distances and of acrimony abounds in texts, but that need not lead us to a jungle of details for the present. Let me now return to the issue of unity. According to an informed opinion, the essence of tradition has to exist in a medium of language. One may demand equally legitimately that the essence of unity, to be understandable, has to exist in the form of a concept in a language. A single word expressing the idea of unity in modern times in the Indo-Aryan languages would be Aika, derived from Eka or one. But the concept of Eka, encompassing Bahuda or the diverse or the many, as found in the Rig Veda, actually equates Eka with several other gods named differently as Indra, Mitra, Varuna, Agni, Matarishan, and so on. And this equation in any case does not have any bearing on the idea of Indian unity. Even the limited samples of textual evidence that I have cited should suggest that those who wrote our early texts appear not to have been terribly concerned with the idea of unity as a hallmark of their society and culture. The texts, in fact, seem to provide an opposite impression. It is therefore somewhat curious that the insistence on the image of India alone representing unity in diversity has to figure in all varieties of Indian historiography, colonial, orientalist, nationalist, Marxist, and what one may perhaps call post-Marxist. The presence of the idea, despite the mandatory accent also on diversity in all branches of writing, is so pronounced that one is inevitably led to ask once again questions which seem to have so far remained unasked in clear terms. One, India indeed represents diversity. How did the diverse elements dissolve their own innate characters to come together to construct or constitute an entity called unity? In other words, what was that magic formula which Indians alone could conceive to transcend all differences to emerge as a united body? Two, is there a historic moment, juncture, which represents the achievement of that unity? For if there is, then the possibility of any new elements further contributing to that unity seems to get automatically precluded as post facto appendages external to the achievement of that unity. Alternatively, is it that what we assume as unity is really an ongoing process towards a new formation? Or has it always been so in the past as well, necessitating that we reconsider and reorient the entire idea of unity in our mindscapes to speculate new alternatives? Before I can think of even facing such basic questions, in addition to the ones I posed in the beginning, let me consider briefly views of two well-known thinkers who both subscribe to the notion of India's unity in diversity, Tagore and Koshambi. Two of Tagore's memorable writings project this idea as their essence: his long musical piece Bharat Tirtha and his short essay Bharatvarshar Itihas. In Bharat Tirtha, two major metaphors are employed. One is that of an auspicious pilgrimage site on the shore of the ocean of great humanity, where people from diverse locations and diverse origins converge, obviously in their quest for a final resting place. The other metaphor is of the body. Bharata is conceived as a body in which the Aryas and Anaryas, Dravidas, Chinas, Sakas, Hunas, Pathans, Mughals all merged. The metaphor of the body is significant because as a living and vibrant organism, all parts of the body or tissue could be in which no organ or tissue could be discarded as redundant. This is precisely the idea that Tagore projects also in his essay Bharatvarshar Itihas, when he says Bharatvarsha has not discarded anything. Bharatvarsha kichhui tag kore nai. Tagore's idea of Indian history being not just a chronicle of genealogies and battles, but of persistent search to forge unity among diversity, of ways of reconciling between seemingly irreconcilable, again underlines the almost inexhaustible range of cultural ingredients which all fuse to emerge as recognizably Indian. Tagore, in talking about unity, did not insist upon unity being accomplished. His use of the term search or sandhan rather pointed to the quest for unity as an ongoing process without the predictability of an inevitable final accomplishment. Tagore's accent on the dynamic process of the move to achieve equilibrium between different cultural elements cannot be taken to mean triumph of one cultural form of expression over the other. All that it can perhaps mean is interaction shorn of cultural value judgment. To Koshambi, India's unity in diversity is almost self-evident. The first sentence of his Culture and Civilization of Ancient India in historical outline starts thus. I quote from him, "A dispassionate observer who looks at India with detachment and penetration would be struck by two mutually contradictory features, diversity and unity at the same time. The endless variety is striking, often incongruous. Costume, speech, the physical appearances of the people, customs, standards of living, food, climate, geographical features all offer the greatest possible differences. The varieties specified here almost reproduce those articulated in the ancient texts, but it's not varieties as such which are significant. To Koshambi, Africa or the single province of Yunnan in China offer as much diversity. What distinguishes India from other countries is, and I quote him, the continuity that we find in India over the last 3,000 years or more. The continuity of Indian culture in its own country is perhaps its most important feature. Koshambi's notion of continuity implies the simultaneous presence of all cultural forms from the most primitive hunting-gathering to the most technologically recent. The survival within different social layers of many forms that allow the reconstruction of totally diverse stages. Continuity which thus took the form of survivals and of the process of tribal societies becoming parts of the general, in other words, of more complex society, may be taken to correspond to Tagore's idea of the all-accommodating nature of India's unity, both notions precluding the necessity of social seismic tensions towards achieving that unity. The presence of diverse elements at different stages of historical change and in ever-dynamic states of equation, however, does not necessarily define unity. The symbols of unity as also its meaning have remained really unspecified. What needs therefore to be understood, and this is precisely why I chose this question chose to present this question before you, how diversity of elements present in Indian society and culture relate to one another and to the complex structure which may be taken to represent unity. I cannot even presume to provide an answer to this question. I can only offer my own modest views on the issue of unity in diversity insofar as the concept relates to the formative stages of Indian society and culture. Before I attempt to do so, let me once more refer to the early texts. If the space conceived in the Puranas and other texts as Bharatavarsha is taken to correspond to India, then there is a Puranic opinion also on what distinguished this Varsha from other Varshas. The distinction from other verses was made by stressing that Bharatavarsha was the only Varsha where karma or action bore its fruit, and casually related to it, where the inhabitants were organized in a fourfold social division, that's varnas. The ideology of karma, in essence, related to the ideologies of dharma, phala, that is fruit of action, and rebirth, was, according to the Puranas, the unique hallmark of Bharatavarsha. While some may like to take karma ideology as the Puranic version of Indian unity, there is a major difficulty in accepting it as what transcended the vast range of diversities in the country. Despite the purpose.
ब्रिटेन में इन दिनों मनचाहे संतान का मुद्दा गर्म है। आनुवंशिक बीमारियों से पूरी तरह से निजात दिलाने के लिए वैज्ञानिकों ने एक नई तकनीक को विकसित किया है।
जनरली ये सिर्फ प्रजनन का एक तरीका है जिसमें माँ अपने जेनेटिक कंट्रीब्यूशन से वंचित ना रह जाए अपने ही बच्चे।
कोई भी रिसर्च अगर हो रहा है तो इट्स ऑलवेज फॉर द बेनिफिट ऑफ द चाइल्ड एंड द पेरेंट।
प्रजनन से पहले ही अगर बीमारी खत्म हो जाती है तो ये बहुत बड़ा प्रगति होगी, लेकिन इस पर अंकुश उतना ही रहे कि हाँ, बीमारी को रोकने के लिए तो टेक्नोलॉजी ठीक है, अदरवाइज नहीं।
जो रूढ़िवादी विचारधारा रखने वालों को टेक्नोलॉजी से कभी कोई परेशानी नहीं होती, उनको परेशानी होती है साइंस से, क्योंकि साइंस सोच बदलने की कोशिश करती है और वो समाज की सोच को जकड़ के रखना चाहते हैं कि कहीं आगे न बढ़ जाए।
साइंस हमेशा सत्य ढूंढने के लिए और प्रोसेसेस नेचर के
Sovereign rulers' sovereignty hinged upon the subordination of multiple other rulers. The Shastras I have cited point to diversities of Janapada cultures and also to the existence of attitude of mutual derision, real or concocted among them. Imagining the existence in the past of a common history, common heroes, a common literature, common art, a common law, may be a satisfying assertion of a colonized patriot. It can hardly pass empirical scrutiny. Do we then abandon the idea of unity altogether? Approached from a historical perspective, the idea of unity, it seems, may at best be considered as a process of interaction, as a process of transformative but unequal dialogue among varied local, sub-regional, regional elements of culture, in other words of Janapadas, Nadud, etc., across time and across spaces. I have argued on another occasion that as a geographical space, India can be viewed as a land of interlocking regions, the cultural implication of which would be that geographically contiguous and interlocking regions would have greater cultural affinity in terms of linguistic and other traits than would two distant regions. Of course, communication and pervasive reach of major symbols of trans-regional cultural affinity were not geographically determined. The agency was ultimately human, and historians keen to decipher the nature of Indian unity may do well to look for both such agencies and those enduring symbols of cultural affinity which are not exclusive to a single segment of Indian populace. The most that I shall be prepared to speculate for the present is that the interactional process developed over time a reference point to which heterogeneous cultural elements and geographical spaces could relate. This reference point was the idea of Bharatavarsha, or any term such as later-day Hindustan, which could substitute Bharatavarsha. This idea of a country could and did accommodate as a single reference point the vast range of diverse, even contradictory traits of different localities, sub-regions and regions. Thus, when an early 14th century inscription from coastal Andhra, one among many such other inscriptions, refers to the location of Tilinga country within the Varsha of Bharata, divided into 9 parts and consisting of many languages and customs, it was both recognizing its affinity with Bharatavarsha and its other Janapadas, as well as asserting its own separate cultural identity in the 14th century context. This identity too would have emerged out of and still contained many differences, and the assertion of a particular identity ought to be seen as an expression of a contingency of that particular historical moment. The point that I think needs to be stressed is that our insistence on the idea of unity generally tends to ignore the implications of the formation of unity. I quote from an article on unity in diversity published in 2007 in EPW. In pre-modern times too, the establishment of a particular way of life generally was accomplished by the subordination or marginalization of other worldviews and practices. Unity in corporative and hierarchical social orders is based on the inequality of its constituents. If the meaning of unity is homogeneity, oneness without variations, contradictions, and without space for dissent, then that would be a meaning which I doubt anyone would like to apply to India, either of the present or of the past. In fact, unity or even formation of a civilization is in a sense destructive. It brings together disparate elements through the decimation or annihilation of a large number of community elements, large number of such elements. Even when pre-civilizational, essentially local and community elements get into the process of civilization formation through any other means, the structure of the new formation invariably implies select accommodation, marginalization, elimination, or subordination. For example, in the process of the emergence of major religious cults, when the Vana, or the forest, merges into the Kshetra, settled agrarian space with a complex social organization, it's not the Bono per se which continues to remain present. Despite the presence of tribal Bono elements in the cult of Jagannatha at Puri, the cult emerged as so thoroughly Brahmanized and identified with Brahmanical notion of social hierarchy that it was inevitable for an egalitarian socio-religious movement such as Mahima Dharma to make it a target of attack. More recently, although the community of Bengali Bhadraloks continue to invoke their goddess Kali as Digambari or Digvasana, that means one whose garment is the sky, or one who is without a garment, as an idol for worship, Kali is made to conform to the norms of Bhadralok propriety by being clad in a sari. Thus, those who attempt to invoke concepts such as dharma or Sanskrit paradigm to conjure up an image of Indian unity appear to be unaware of the negative potentialities of unity. Consider the following statement recently made in relation to a possibly timeless India, and I quote here from an article recently published from the Bulletin of the Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture. A multilingual, a multiracial, a multi-religious, a multicultural India had some kind of an integrative framework of a nation governed by dharma. The projection of dharma as an integrative framework fails to recognize that dharmas were multiple, and in any case, in the event of failure of dharmas to resolve an issue, it was the Raja Sasana or the royal edict which ultimately prevailed according to textually prescribed procedures. Dharmas could and therefore did clash. As for Sanskritic paradigm symbolizing Indian unity because of its pan-Indian reach as a sacred language and its ideological underpinnings, it's perhaps necessary to recall what linguists have told us. Writing way back in 1954, M.B. Emenu remarked by way of explaining the initial reluctance of linguists to accept the possibility of Sanskrit borrowing from Dravidian. And this is what he says: Indian civilization itself with its enthronement of Sanskrit at the expense of other languages, caused Western scholars to think this way about Sanskrit, that the enthronement of Sanskrit was at the expense of Dravidian and other languages has been stretched further by Emmanuel. He goes on to say, the geographical distribution and the nature of boundary in central India between Dravidian speakers and the speakers of Indo-Aryan languages that descended from the invader language Sanskrit are good evidence that Dravidian has been steadily retreating before Indo-Aryan. More recently, an overview of the linguistic prehistory of South Asia postulates the following about the Austroasiatic Munda languages in relation to its distribution in South Asia. And I quote from an article here, the Munda languages are spoken primarily in northeastern India, with outliers encapsulated among Indo-Aryan languages in central India. The geography of Munda does suggest that it was once more widespread in India and has been pushed back or encapsulated by both Indo-Aryan and Dravidian. Indeed, the early literature detected Munda influences far to the west of the Indo-Aryan zone, even in the Dardic languages of Pakistan, an idea still countenanced in recent publications. One also ought not to be oblivious of the fact that in addition to being the vehicle of exquisite literature and subtle philosophical thought of wide reach, Sanskrit has for long been the purveyor of a most pernicious ideology of social inequality through the concepts of Varna, Jati, Varna Shankara, condemning a major chunk of Indian humanity to degraded segregation and untouchability. Sanskritic paradigm was pervasive, but it was a symbol of ideological dominance, not of shared participation, without which the meaning of unity remains hollow. It's an irony of history that movement of diverse cultural spaces to come together, to integrate, to function as a united entity happens invariably by sacrificing a multitude of such spaces. The nature of the sacrifice depending on the historical context of their disappearance. In India, many did not disappear, but went nevertheless through a process of change or of metamorphosis. Many others survived, giving the country a unique appearance of continuity. History too has gifted us new cultural forms which have entered into new relationships of interaction. In my ode to diversity, which I fear may turn into an elegy sooner than later, I simply plead for the survival of diverse cultural spaces in a world which is fast becoming a victim of dangerous global homogenization. We have started to experience the diverse splendors of our vast universe in our neighborhood megamoles instead of learning to experience it all around us. In our own country, the massive spread of what I call Magimania from Kinnaur to Kanyakumari simultaneously combined with increasing the persistent threats to our personal and community culinary preferences is paralleled by the increasing centralism and autocracy of today's Madhya Desha and the steadily growing imperialistic ambition of a single language in a multilingual terrain. The evidence that I cited above from our ancient texts of cultural differences, tensions, even of conflicts, was evidence of dynamic interactions in a heterogeneous society. Keeping the heritage of that glorious, if contentious, heterogeneity in mind, let us hope that today we do not deliberately consign that country, our many Indias, to the black hole of robotic uniformity in the name of integration and unity. Thank you all. Thank you all very much for your patient hearing. Thank you.